This is the DRS train.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the DRS Train podcast. I'm Kyron Smith, and joining me today is our resident Aloncista and general all-round F1 expert, the Italian stallion, Ace himself. Ace, how are you doing?
So, I'm very sleep deprived, but
Great.
kind of happy. So I'm not sure. Let's start with the race start because the starts were, I'd say, moderately unimpressive, except obviously for the crash. But we can see from the first rows that nothing much happened. Verstappen took away well, Perez took away well, Sainz, Norris, Alonso, they all took away well. Only in the back, when there were the two RBs on the mediums and they all started badly compared to the soft starters behind them, then it became chaotic and we had the crash. What do you have to say about that?
Look, I think I agree with you that those guys starting on softs obviously had an inherent advantage. But to me, the start was emblematic of what we've seen so many times in modern Formula One. There's one bloke who's doing one thing, and then the other one's doing another thing, and neither's paying attention. And you get this clumsy, needless accident. And, Anthony Davidson, I think he was a terrific driver. He didn't have a lot of opportunity in Formula One, but he said that he didn't blame anyone for that accident. And I want to focus on that accident because I actually think Ricciardo could have avoided that. And I do blame it on him. And it's not enough to say, oh, well, he didn't know he wasn't there. Well, he should have known. Like you said, it was a chaotic race start. People were swarming into the first few corners. What's Ricciardo doing out there? What do you think about that specifically, Ace? I mean, do you think Ricciardo was at fault for that first lap incident at the start?
I think that it's a racing incident, but that's my opinion. I think it's more interesting that in the podcast after the race, uh, I don't remember what's that. I just remember it as the podcast with the podium finishers. And they saw the accident and they said, oh, yeah, Albon went into the blind spot of Ricciardo, and so they crashed. So I'm willing to believe it's a racing incident, not totally Daniel's fault.
Yeah, I understand that, but the drivers are probably a bit hesitant to be calling someone out live on television like that. But fair enough. If he was in a blind spot, we know in these cars, given how big they are, it's more difficult than ever to spot them. So that is a valid point. It's just unfortunate that we had an accident, which gave us some drama, but gave us a pretty long break too, didn't it? I mean, a lot of teams were then kind of thinking about how to approach the red flag period and the restart. And I think we saw some interesting strategies begin to play out at this point. What do you think about that?
So I'm trying to go by mind, so maybe I get some things wrong, but I think everybody had stayed on the same tires except Mercedes.
Yep.
And then in the back, we had some very mixed up because both Alpines went on the hards for the start. Then Tsunoda made the first start on the mediums, but the second start was on the softs. And Sargent too. The first start was on the softs, but the second was on the hards. Maybe I'm wrong on Sargent, but the others are right. I'm quite sure of that. And it's interesting because the race start took the same positions as when the red flag came out. So they did not make a new start. And so Tsunoda had fallen back. And I think that was a problem for this race because RB was the sixth fastest car here. So they should have reasonably finished 11th and 12th. They made the start on the mediums, hoping to hold position, and then they would easily have finished 11th and 12th. But once they got overtaken and they lost track position, Tsunoda got bogged down in the midfield. He got stuck behind other cars, then he was undercut by Bottas, then he had to protect from the undercut from Ocon, and he was in DRS trains, unable to overtake, and then he had to go way longer on the last stint. So
Hmm.
he, instead, at the front of the field, we didn't see that much movement, that much dynamicism.
Right.
I'm not sure if this is the right word.
No,
It
it
was
is.
uh, it was way quieter at the front as a race. Piastri was stuck behind Alonso. Mercedes switched to a two-stop strategy, and I think for Russell it kind of worked, but not that very much. The very interesting strategy at the front was Leclerc, because Leclerc actually made the one-stop work, the only one who managed to do one stop. And so
Right.
the restart made for a very different, for a very wide variety of strategies, from soft, medium, hards of Alonso to the simple medium, hard, hard of no medium, hard, medium of Red Bull and of Sainz. The McLarens went for medium, hard, hard. The Mercedes for hard, hard, medium. Then we had Stroll, who made 3 pit stops, but really didn't matter much at the front. Instead, at the back was very interesting to follow all those strategies.
Okay, so let's back that up because that was a lot of good info. And I think Kimi also drove an amazing. I'm sorry, not Kimi. I saw Alonso drove an unbelievable race because let's just talk about his strategy. It was interesting, right? So let's back up and talk about that. He started on the soft tire, right? And I think the game plan was to get that tire out of the way as soon as possible. But they did a good job, didn't they? Of kind of neutralizing any disadvantage they got. I mean, what do you think about that? Because, far from me to say I'm not the biggest fan of this driver, but we all know that he's capable of some stunning performances. And I actually think today was one of them. But I want to start at the beginning of his strategy because what do you think about the way they managed that? Because some people thought if Alonso starts on soft, he's going to be a sitting duck, et cetera later on. But I think they managed it pretty well. At the beginning of the race, and they got that out of the way, don't you think?
So Alonso and Stroll strategies were based on what happened in Japan last year, because last year Alonso also started on softs, and he did the first stint, he overtook some cars, then they had to pit him early, which got him stuck behind the Alpines, which meant he had to pit again, which basically took him away from the fight with Mercedes, Ferrari. No, McLaren was way ahead. McLaren was out of
Yeah,
their league. But
they were out
he
of the
was
league.
taken
Yeah,
out of the fight with Mercedes and Ferrari. So I'm, I don't think it actually made that much of a difference, because what happened this time? So this time he started on soft. He did not make up places at the start. He again had to nurse the tire, except last year he had to pit early and got stuck in the midfield. This year he went long enough to pit and remain ahead of Magnussen and Ocon. Instead, Piastri, who tried to undercut him, was stuck in traffic for a bit. And
mm,
so ultimately, I don't think it worked, because it didn't work last year because they pit him too early. And it didn't work this year because Alonso didn't make up places at the start. So I'm not a fan of his strategy. And also, Aston today was the fourth best car. They brought upgrades,
interesting.
and Mercedes is a car that struggles with high-speed corners. So they were always going to struggle here in Japan, as we saw. And so Alonso really finished ahead of Piastri, the only car who was faster than him. And even then, it was a bit of circumstances finishing ahead of Piastri because
So
Piastri.
let's back up. Let's back up because I respect that and I'm happy to accept that. Fernando really finished where the car should finish. I like that narrative. But let's be honest here. Why was Stroll so far behind Alonso if that's the case? I mean, it was just like, is this just Lance Stroll once again showing he's not F1 material? Because that was a huge difference between them. Or am I missing something here? I mean, it's just very difficult to gauge where that car is because one of them is either doing a very good job and the other one's nowhere. And I'm not saying, Lance didn't manage his tires well. Lance did manage his tires well, maybe even better than Alonso at some stages. But again, like the gulf between those two is so big, it just leaves me, Ace, second guessing. I have no clue how quick that Aston is because one of them is fighting with Alpines and Lord knows what in the midfield, and the other one's fighting McLaren and finishing ahead of two Mercedes. How quick is this car?
So in my opinion, think that they screwed up Stroll's setup. So they are not using the same setup as far as I understand, because Alonso in qualifying, he was the fastest car, the fastest top speed with the 326 kilometers per hour out of the top 5 teams. And Stroll today was crying that he didn't have top speed on the straights, and so he couldn't overtake cars, and he was overtaken instead. And it was the opposite today with Alonso. Alonso had no problems letting Piastri in the DRS range, and then letting him get close, because at the end of the straight he was still half a second ahead. He had that much top speed to be able to afford to give DRS to Piastri. So I
Okay.
think they have different setups. Also, Stroll in quali said, I did a fine lap, the car felt good, the lap times just isn't there. Which makes sense if he's lacking a lot of top speed, unlike Alonso. So today, I'd say the Stroll had a bad setup, and so he was compromised in quali. And starting so far back, he was compromised all throughout the race. He was always stuck behind a car or something. When he wasn't stuck behind a car, he was struggling with the tires because the softs couldn't do 17 laps, and so at the end, Hulkenberg overtook him. So
Interesting. Okay, that makes a lot more sense to me because he did go on the radio at one point saying, "Oh, they're in a different category." You remember that? So that kind of points to your analysis there that look, maybe Stroll was the victim of just an operational mistake where the team went in a direction, and Stroll's a part of that, but they went in a direction where the setup was just not suitable. And he was mugged down the straights, wasn't he? But then, fair enough. Alonso then finished ahead of the one McLaren. So if we think that Aston were the fourth quickest team, that means Mercedes was the fifth quickest team, and that's really because, as you said, they're not great in the high-speed corners. They tried something to get themselves in the mix, didn't they? And Hamilton even wanted to do a different strategy at one point, but that didn't really work out for him. Once again, beaten by Russell, and Lewis wasn't too happy on the radio either. What do you make of the Mercedes' strategy? It was odd, wasn't it? I mean, Hamilton tried something different, and it just didn't work, did it?
I don't think it's odd. They knew they were on the back foot.
Right.
They knew that they weren't faster than Ferrari, McLaren, Aston, and so they simply tried something else. They had a red flag at the start. They had two sets of hards. I think it was very reasonable to try and going very long. Also, if a safety car came out very late, if the Sergeant, instead of stopping on the it's not mud, it's on
Uh,
the gravel, Yes.
I know. Yeah, I know what you
If
mean.
he
Okay.
instead went into the barriers and a safety car came out, Mercedes was gonna have a huge advantage. So
Yeah,
it, I think it was a very reasonable strategy what Mercedes did. It actually worked because Russell finished ahead of Piastri.
yeah,
A lot of stuff happened because Piastri had basically killed his tires by
yeah.
staying behind Alonso, and then locked the brakes,
And
and
Russell,
Russell got past, so normal.
you're so right. And actually, it's a good point because it shows you what a good job Russell did. Didn't Russell nearly jump Leclerc as well coming out of that pit stop? I think it was Leclerc. But you remember the Norris and um, Leclerc pitted at the same time, and Norris came out behind Russell. Leclerc came out in front, and I think that was, first of all, that was an interesting moment because if Russell had jumped Leclerc, that would have really, really, I think, maybe made things a little bit more difficult, but not too much because Norris did pass Russell pretty quickly. But I think that was actually a wrong strategy call by McLaren. Because I think if they had kept Norris out there, Leclerc would have been fighting with Russell potentially, or maybe Leclerc would have been caught up in traffic, and Norris might have had a chance to jump Leclerc. What do you think about that? I didn't feel like McLaren there made the right move to pit Norris in with Leclerc, but what do you think about it?
Norris got extremely unlucky, and
Yeah, I agree.
The McLaren pit crew, no, not the pit crew, the strategy crew, wasn't very quick to understand what was going to happen. So
Mm,
L- Russell had pitted. He was gonna get into the pit stop window of Norris. Norris was gonna have to stop again later on, and McLaren thought that it was better to pit Norris early and not have him stuck behind Russell. So they called him into the pit. What happened then? Leclerc went off. He got overtaken by Perez, yes, he ruined his tires, but he kept Norris behind. That lost Norris a lot of time being stuck behind Leclerc, who was going slower because his tires were dirty. So when they went into the pit, he had lost, let's say, 1.5 seconds over the lap, and that was the window he had over Russell. If Leclerc hadn't gone off and Norris had pitted in that lap, he would have come out ahead of Russell perfectly fine. Instead, the strategy crew didn't catch on this detail. They pitted him anyway, and so he came out behind Russell. And also, he wasn't gonna go longer than Leclerc, because I think Leclerc was gonna still go longer, but once he ruined his tire, he had to stop. And so, by pitting Norris in that moment, they also lost the chance to try an overcut or go longer to have newer tires at the end, and maybe that was enough to overtake Leclerc. So I think
yeah.
that Leclerc going off simply caught McLaren off guard, and that pit stop became a mistake. If Leclerc hadn't gone off, the pit stop would have been fine.
It's a very interesting. That is a very, very interesting point. That Leclerc's mistake almost fooled McLaren into a mistake themselves. Um, Come on, Zach Brown, you can't make that mistake. What are you guys doing? Ron wouldn't have made that mistake. It's just a shame because I think Norris had a chance to jump Leclerc, and who knows? He wasn't that far behind, was he? You know, I think if I'm Norris and I'm looking at that race, that was the pivotal moment because after that he was just stuck behind Leclerc the entire race, lost time. He could have had track position, and either they should have done an overcut or they should have tried a risky undercut way earlier, where they could have gotten him out in some clean air and he could have jumped Leclerc. So you're right; they pitted right at the wrong time. It was unlucky as well, but you know you expect McLaren to be a little bit more, have a little bit more mental alacrity than that. Come on, Zach Brown, get together. Anyways, moving on from that. Um, let's talk about Ferrari. I think I'm somebody that has not been shy about saying that Charles Leclerc, despite his tremendous one lap speed, has had some issues in the races. And those issues are little errors, getting too emotional in the heat of battle, and most of all, his tire management. Let's not talk about his intercondition driving, which I'm not a big fan of. I really don't think he's good in intermediate conditions. But today, I think I saw one of the best ever tire management performances from Charles Leclerc. I did not expect it. I don't think anyone expected it. He drove the wheels off those medium tires, didn't he? He made them last in a way nobody else could. And that's what got him almost ahead of his teammate by the end of the race, because he went from eighth. And at one point, he was in a podium position. So how was he able to do that? And in many cases, if you're looking at the number of positions he made up, was that the right strategy? I think that was the right strategy, but especially because he was so good on it. I don't think everyone could have done that. It's a very uncharacteristically good tire management performance by Charles. And, it wasn't enough to beat his teammate, but let's just talk about him extending that medium tire length. What did you think about that? Because I was amazed at what he was doing there.
So I think that Ferrari was quite clearly the second best car today. It's
Interesting.
maybe not in quali, but in the race they definitely had better pace than McLaren. McLaren knew that they undercut. They made Norris pit very early to undercut Sainz, and then see if they can later on keep the position on track. So I think it's it's a it's reasonably true that
Yeah.
Ferrari was the second best car today. They definitely had great degradation, in the sense none. And so that allowed Ferrari to make a one-stop work. And Leclerc, I would say he really did drive extremely well, except he went off. So I'm gonna take my time to make a brief discussion about Leclerc this weekend. He had only one set of new softs in quali in Q3, so they made him go out of sequence in between the other two fast laps of the other cars. Leclerc went out and did his own lap. And then we all saw that when the other cars went out for the second fast lap in Q3, almost none of them improved on their times. So we can believe that the track had gotten worse in Q3. So Leclerc, by making the lap later on than the others, he actually ran on a worse track, and that explains why he qualified 8th instead of 5 or P4 or P3. So, but to prove this, that Leclerc was just unfortunate on Saturday and that he actually is the faster driver in the team, he should have driven the race he drove today without going off. Because when you start making mistakes, that simply doesn't look good. Leclerc was finished before today. He wasn't gonna finish any better than before today, given he was starting P8 and had to go on a one stop. But if he hadn't gone off, he would have kept Perez back. Perez was stuck behind Leclerc, if you remember. Despite having newer tires, he wasn't able to overtake Leclerc. And that allowed Sainz to slowly close in on Norris and Perez. But once Leclerc went off, Perez had free air in front of him and simply flew away. Sainz had the same pace as Perez, but once Perez was 6 seconds ahead, he finished 6 seconds ahead. So we could believe that Leclerc making that mistake could have cost Ferrari a P2 instead of a P3. So you see, this all we do not put Leclerc today on the same level as Verstappen, as Alonso, as maybe Tsunoda, because he he got bogged down in a midfield, but it's not entirely his fault. And he was having a great race pace on the last stint. Stroll wasn't gonna catch him, and so
Right.
if in the same works also for Russell and Norris, they also made mistakes today, and they were extremely fast. But they keep making these mistakes, and it doesn't look good on them because it 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 costs it costs it costs them positions, it costs them time, it costs the team points. Today, if Russell hadn't overtaken Piastri on the last lap, Aston Martin would have been fourth in the championship. And only because Piastri made a mistake of his own, Russell got past. So
Yeah.
I am not sure what to say about Leclerc. He
Here,
drives sometimes extremely well, and even when he drives extremely well, he makes mistakes.
this is the thing, Ace. It was such a little mistake, but it had such big ramifications. This is what people don't understand. Like these little people on X and Twitter, or whatever you want to call it. They're like, "Oh, look how good Charles Leclerc is." Um, why did he make another mistake, mate? Michael wouldn't have done that. Senna wouldn't have done that. Kimi Raikkonen wouldn't have done that. Listen. I like Charles Leclerc. And I think one of the reasons that he got quicker and quicker in the race is that this is a rear limited circuit. And we know he likes a stronger front end on the cars. I think the car was just coming to him in ways where we heard Verstappen's radio where they were saying, how's the setup? And Max is like, look, we had understeer and now it's turning more into oversteer. So I think things really came together for him in the race. But I want everyone to take a step back and look at the final result. Sainz 3, Leclerc 4. Leclerc made a mistake as well that may have even hindered Ferrari's result a bit further. He had an impressive drive through the field, but he shouldn't have even been in that position, and he still was beaten by his teammate, and he still made a mistake that may have hurt his team's chances in the big picture to potentially get Perez or hinder Perez more than they did. So people often say like, "Oh, like Ciaron, you're delusional." I've been called that word about 500 times. 5,000 times over my, brief career. But I really think that the criticism is warranted. He's a terrific driver in terms of speed, but he does make, as you said, Ace, these little mistakes, and it's not the exception. It's the norm with him. And this is something that if I'm Ferrari, I'm thinking, what on earth have we done that we're letting a guy who's more consistent than Leclerc right now leave the team for marketing? I think Ferrari are. Did you see Fred Vasser's face, Ace, during that race? Did he not look very annoyed and nervous to you? To me, he looked very annoyed at what was happening because I think he wanted Leclerc to beat beat Carlos, because it hasn't happened yet, but there's no way that the outgoing driver is going to get like preference or the same treatment as the driver they want to say is better than him. So I think that he had a good comeback, but I agree with your points that Charles should have done, again, this whole weekend, he could have done better. And he needs to clean up his weekends. But anyways, strong 3-4 for Ferrari in the end. Anything else you want to add to that?
Yes, just it's 4 races into the season, so maybe it's a bit early to start speaking about this, but I would
Right.
like to just make everyone realize that last year the Ferrari was extremely strong in qualifying and then he struggled in the race. Basically,
Right.
what Aston Martin is experiencing this year. And last year, Leclerc was extremely strong in quali, got way more poles than he should have, and then in the races he
Mm-hmm.
never won. Instead, this year the car is the opposite. It not so good in quali, but the race pace extremely good. It could even rival Red Bull on some tracks, and that's just the beginning of the year, with still development still to come. So, what did we see from Leclerc? The driver who's considered the best qualifier of the entire grid,
Ace, I want
That
to
is
interrupt you
struggling
for
in
one
quali.
second. Ace, I want to interrupt you for 1 second. Shout out to Juan Pablo Montoya in 2002. 6 poles in a row. He didn't win a single one of them. You're following in his footsteps, Charles. Way to go. Back to your point. There was an awesome analysis. Continue what you were saying, Ace.
Yes, so this year the car isn't strong in quali, so you'd expect the best qualifier on the grid to actually out-qualify the car so it starts well, and then since it has great race pace, he's gonna drive a great race, unlike last year. Instead, no, Leclerc is struggling in quali. I just don't know what to make of this. Maybe it's just because it's 4 races. Once we have more races, we're gonna see changes. We're gonna see that this isn't actually what's happening. But so far, I'm seeing this pattern and I'm not liking it because
That,
I'm not exactly sure why, but it doesn't look good. That I, I I
mm-hmm.
actually know why. Because this year the Aston Martin is strong in quali and weak in the races. So you put Alonso in the Aston Martin and he drives quali perfectly well. And then in the races he keeps finishing ahead of cars faster than he is. And that isn't happening with Leclerc. He isn't making up for the shortcomings of the car. Alonso is, Leclerc isn't. So maybe
Yeah.
it's early to speak, but I'm seeing this pattern.
I'm going to say
Moving
it
on.
right.
Okay,
But
no,
here's
no.
what Ace. One thing. Ace. One thing. Do we know what Charles Leclerc said after qualifying? Was he happy with the setup of his car, or did he say he had understeer? Because what I saw today was the effects of a rear limited circuit bearing fruit. Right, rear limited circuit. Right, means your rear tires degrade more quickly than the fronts, which means that you're going to have a looser back end, probably a stronger front end as the race goes on. So I think that also contributed. It was track specific too. To me, Leclerc thrives in the rear limited circuits more than he does front limited, and I think that certainly helped him today as well. Um, I don't know why this trend is happening with him this year. It's been an unimpressive start to the season. We can all say that for him. He has not been really what we expected, given that the announcement was made that he gets his contract extension. People are once again talking about him as like a future champion. Sainz is on his way out, and it's Sainz that has the upper hand more than I've ever seen Sainz have the upper hand. Strange, isn't it? What's going on?
I
Um,
just think that Sainz isn't making mistakes. He's driving cleanly, well and cleanly. He doesn't make mistakes. He drives fast. He's not actually faster than Leclerc, but if Leclerc is making mistakes, Sainz finishes ahead. So I think that is what is happening. Sainz is simply driving smarter.
right. All right. As Sebastian Vettel would say, honestly, what are we doing here? Okay, let's move on to. We've talked about Sainz. We talked about Leclerc. We know how their strategies panned out. We know Leclerc did a good job, but not quite good enough to beat Sainz. Let's just spare a thought for before we get to McLaren. I want to talk about Red Bull. Okay, and the reason I want to talk about them is, Max and Sergio have had what, like 3-1-2s this year. But what do we think about Perez right now? What do we really think about his performance? One of the main contenders for his seat was Daniel Ricciardo. And Daniel Ricciardo is having a horrific season thus far. He is driving like a total clown. I said that. Nobody else on the podcast said that. I said that. But where's Sergio right now? Because is this just a case of Sergio knows if he brings it home second, he'll keep getting these contract extensions? Or is he just because 11 seconds off the pace, off Max, to me, that's a bit unacceptable, really. He was really far off again. And I'm just wondering, you know, is the Red Bull where Sergio's putting it, or did Max really put in like a very, very dominant performance again today? let's talk about Red Bull a little bit. What do you how do you think their race panned out?
So the race was very straightforward. Verstappen won from lap 1 to lap 53, and
Of course.
Perez didn't get overtaken at the start, started second, he finished second. So nothing much to say about the race.
Oh,
About Perez's current form, I'm not sure what's the reason behind it. First of all, I'd like to say it's just 4 races. Last year, after 4 races, Perez was doing very well. From the fifth onwards, he started to struggle a lot. So let's
yeah.
see if this pattern repeats this year.
My
Then,
point to you, Ace, is like, should he really be fighting? Should a Red Bull driver really be fighting with like Leclerc and Norris? Or do you think
yes,
the Red Bull so you think that the car wasn't so much quicker that they shouldn't have been fighting? You just think Max did an amazing job once again, basically. That's what you're telling me.
yes, I think the car is still clearly the fastest. I think that the big improvement from last year is that, and I'm not sure, so this could be the second reason why Perez is doing well. What they worked on from last year to the new car of this year is making the window of operation larger. So Verstappen is fast, but Perez also, without driving like Verstappen, can be fast, even if it's not right on the best optimal window. He can deviate a bit and still be slightly slower than Verstappen. And last year it was different. If you deviated from this window of operation, you lost a lot of performance, and that's what was happening with Perez. They improved this aspect, and now Perez can drive as fast, well, not as fast, but close to Verstappen.
Okay, hold the brakes on that. You know, like let's put the 1998 McLaren brakes that they had for the first 2 races, which were illegal, on for a second, because I don't necessarily agree with that, and here's why. What I'm trying to get at is, let's first answer this question: do you think the Red Bull this year has a larger gap to the second quickest car than it did last year, or do you think last year's car was more dominant? And
Last
let's
year
start
was
with
more dominant.
right. So if that's the case, okay, interesting. So then what we're saying is that it's more plausible that Perez can fight with that. It's more acceptable that Perez is fighting with Leclerc and Norris than it would have been last year, and that it doesn't necessarily reflect that badly on Sergio because Max is just doing an unbelievable job, and Sergio's kind of putting the car where we think it should be. That's what I'm trying to gauge. Like, how badly is Sergio underperforming right now, if at all? It's hard to tell, but I think in a sense maybe I agree with you, but I still feel like that car is so quick. They shouldn't really be fighting with a Ferrari and a McLaren at any point. I want to just talk about basically what we saw there with Red Bull. It was a extremely well managed race overall. This is the first time in F1 history we've had 4-1-2s, 3 of them Red Bull. The ominous thing here is that even if the car isn't quite as quick as last year's car, it's still quick enough that we're getting incredibly one-dimensional and obvious endings to races. Because for all the excitement at the beginning, even last race, we needed Max to retire to really have a race. And, I'm just hoping somebody can step up at some point. And it just looks like another year where we're going to see Max run into the distance, Sergio just get into second, and the rest of them squabbling behind. But, I guess that's what happens in Formula One. You do the best job, you get the biggest rewards. Um, well,
So,
then yeah.
a point about car performance. You're asking if just being 2 times faster than everybody else should lead to being this dominant on track. And you're doubting that.
Well,
Well,
I'm what I'm saying, Ace, is should Perez be fighting with the McLaren and the Ferrari? Like, should that really be something that should be happening? If the car is the best car, shouldn't he be where Max is? Or are we saying that no, it's okay that Perez fought with a Ferrari and a McLaren today because the Red Bull wasn't that much quicker and Max is just Max? You see what I'm saying? I'm trying to gauge if Perez is doing a good job or if Perez is once again underperforming. And it's difficult, you know? These are difficult questions to gauge and to understand, but
I think Perez did. I think
mhm.
I think Perez did a perfectly fine job. I just
Okay.
gonna go back to Australia. So Red Bull, Verstappen retires, Perez is stuck behind, then he has problems, can't be fast. So it's basically a Ferrari versus McLaren situation. Now, we know that Ferrari was faster than McLaren, but not by much. What did we see last race? 1-2 Ferrari. Even just having a slight car advantage, if a driver doesn't make mistakes, he's gonna finish ahead of that car. And that doesn't change that he had to fight against that car. Sainz, Sainz no, because he got lucky with the virtual safety car, but Leclerc had to fight with the McLarens until the end. And what did we see in this race? With Red Bull's advantage over Ferrari a bit bigger than Ferrari's advantage over McLaren in Australia as a comparison. We saw this race that Perez had to fight against the Ferraris simply because they Norris had gone had Norris went for a undercut, and because Leclerc went very, very, very long. Otherwise,
Mm.
he was ahead of Sainz all the time. And Sainz was the car he was really fighting against. The others, they simply were ahead because of the strategy. It wasn't really ahead. So basically, Perez was always ahead of the cars he was fighting in this race. I don't think that's bad at all. I don't think he's underperforming. Yes, he isn't as fast as Verstappen, but aside from that, I think being 10 seconds away from Verstappen is Perez's maximum pace. So I don't think he's underperforming.
Okay. You know what? That's a great way to put it, and I'm going to concede that point. When I think about the top 8 or so drivers, actually, Piastri was the one that should have done better. He really did burn his tires a bit too much, and he finished behind an Aston Martin, which he definitely had a quicker car than the Aston. So actually, I'm going to say Piastri is probably the guy who should have done a bit better among the front runners. He's having a bit of a sophomore slump. I hope he doesn't continue that. But you know, that's something to also remember that you know, there was a driver that perhaps underperformed. Maybe it wasn't Perez today; it was actually the second McLaren driver. But moving on from those guys, let's just quickly touch on. You know, we've talked about the big strategies among the front runners, how they all played out. Um, let's talk about some of the midfield and back marker guys quickly. Who do you want to start with? I want to start with Alpine. Um, I don't know what to say about this team. Frankly, I'm depressed and ashamed. You know, Esteban Ocon went and said at the end of last year that, you know, he's going to be in war mode, and the only thing he's been fighting has been his race engineer. I mean, that was a vicious exchange when his race engineer said, "Mate, you need to push," and then Ocon said, "What do you think I've been doing?" That is not a happy team. That is an awful car, god awful. I'm just so annoyed because I do think they have 2 competent drivers, but again, they just fell back in this race once again. What do you think about Alpine, Ace, right now?
So, first of all, Ocon has beaten Gasly in qualifying yet again. And he then
Yes.
went into Q2, so great for him. Then at the restart on hards, he overtook all the other midfielder. He was 10th, if I'm not mistaken, at the lap 4.
Yeah, he
So
was.
even on the hards, he was ahead of the soft runners. So that was the best possible setup Alpine could have asked for. What happened? It happened that Alpine was overtaken on the straights. They could do nothing about that. Then,
Yep.
so they tried to one stop. It didn't work. They went for a two stop, undercutting the cars he that had overtaken him, and it almost worked. He was overtaken only by Tsunoda, but the others, when there were five cars into the pits, they were all protecting from Ocon's undercut. And so it almost worked because they overtook all of them except Tsunoda. So even that
Yep.
vicious exchange on the radio, I don't think it was vicious at all. I think it's perfectly normal. And ultimately it worked. He really undercut all those cars. Then, of course, he was overtaken back like nothing. So today, Alpine was clearly by far the worst car. I think the drivers really, especially Ocon, really drove the wheels off that car. And
Yep.
nothing much to say. They brought upgrades. Maybe they still don't understand them, so they couldn't get the perfect setup for the new car. Or maybe say they were really small thing. They didn't actually change much, and the really upgrade is coming at Imola. So let's see. I don't think it's any different from what we saw the last races.
Yeah,
Then
it's such a
moving on.
shame. Yeah, moving on. I
No,
just
no,
want to
go on.
quickly. I want to reiterate what you said though, because Ocon was 10th in the slowest car on the grid at one point. I mean, chapeau, Esteban. Chapeau, my friend. That is war mode, but it didn't mean anything, as you said. The car just wasn't up to it. And I do remember that DRS train being formed all for nothing. Sacre bleu, honestly. Moving on to Haas, and perhaps let's touch on Williams as well. I don't know about these two teams. I mean, when Grosjean and Magnussen were teammates, at least we remembered the races because these two would always be, performing some clown circus show. I just don't even really remember much of the race for Haas. And I just remember Albon crashing for Williams and Sargent just being absolutely nowhere. So maybe I was wrong. Maybe Sargent made one pass. But what do we think about these two teams? I mean, you can't say they had a very good race, can you?
For us, yes, Haas had a great race. They went for a they went for a very unorthodox strategy. It almost worked. Simply, okay, I'm gonna do this whole discussion after a brief uh, Williams discussion. So what happened with Williams? Albon was taken out immediately, but in qualifying he was speaking that he didn't feel good with the car. So Sargent crashed, and so he didn't even have the upgrades. And I'd say, good job, Logan. You still have a chassis for next race, so if next race is better for your car, you can actually score points. Today was a lost cause. It doesn't matter that you went into the gravel. You would have finished ahead of the Alpines, but it really wouldn't have changed much. So moving on from Williams, let's talk about Haas
Yeah, let's
and
talk.
Racing Bulls. Because what did Haas do in this race? They differentiated the strategies between Hulkenberg and Magnussen. Now, what did Haas do with their cars? They gave them a lot of top speed. So in the straights, they would not get overtaken by the other cars. Basically the same strategy as Saudi Arabia. Then Hulkenberg pitted very early to try to undercut everybody, and then Hulkenberg went long, 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 very long.
Yeah.
Magnussen instead did his own little thing. He kept ahead of the cars he could stay ahead. Then in the second stint, he slowed down and started to hold them back. What did this do? It meant that Hulkenberg would go very, very long, it wouldn't lose much time, then he would pit at the very end and be very fast and overtake whoever he wants.
Right.
It actually worked because Hülkenberg finished 11th, even overtaking Stroll at the end on the Aston Martin. Stroll
Yeah.
was on the softs, very old, almost dead tires, so but he finished 11th. Why not 10th? Because Tsunoda was stuck behind Magnussen. They pitted all together to not get undercut by Ocon, and the Racing Bulls mechanics did an extraordinary job in putting Tsunoda out in front of the Haas.
Yeah.
That gave Tsunoda all the race pace he wanted, the free air. He showed the race pace of the car. The car was sixth fastest, and he really showed that in the last stint he did. And Hülkenberg couldn't catch him. Stroll couldn't catch him. Tsunoda was 10th, and he finished 10th. If the Racing Bulls mechanics didn't do as good of a job as they did, Haas would have gotten points. So
Sure.
Haas did not do a bad weekend. They did very good. Simply they were caught by Racing Bulls doing such a great pit stop. That's all happened.
I agree with you, and that was a pivotal moment. Sonoda even ran on the radio, didn't he, and thanked his team. He knew what had happened. His team did a great job and got him in front. Shout out to RB, as they call themselves now, Visa, Cash App, whatever they're called. But terrific job by the pit crew there. Classy stuff. But what do we think about Haas this year then? Because last year they had some serious issues with tire wear, especially around these rear limited circuits like Suzuka. They were just nowhere. Have they sorted that out? Are they better this year compared to last year on that front, or do you think those issues still linger? It looks like they've kind of made a step forward when it comes to addressing their tire management, but it's still not where it needs to be. What do you think?
I think that Haas right now for a midfielder is a very good car. That's all
Mm,
there is. They're seventh best. They're only worse than Racing Bulls and not that much worse. So I think that, and they brought the fight to Racing Bulls. Today they were the seventh best car, and they almost beat Racing Bulls.
all right, you know
So
what? Let's
I think
let's
Haas is not only a good car, I think they're also executing the races very well.
let's rank the cars this weekend right now. Okay, so number one was Red Bull.
Yes,
Number two was Ferrari.
yes,
Number three was McLaren.
yes,
Number four, we think, and I think after your convincing analysis, is Aston Martin with a horrible setup decision for Stroll. So, but they're still fourth
in
fastest this
this
weekend.
race, yes, Aston Martin is fourth.
Exactly, just for Suzuka. So they were fourth quickest this weekend. Mercedes were fifth quickest.
Yes,
Sixth quickest, we think, is RB.
yes,
And then now it gets dicey. So seventh quickest, I mean, are we really going to say that Haas was the seventh quickest team?
yes. I think it makes sense. They were very good in Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
They were very good in Australia.
Fair.
I think they were also very good in Bahrain. So
Okay.
I think it's
And
very reasonable for a seventh. I think that in eighth there is Kick Sauber,
right.
but it's a close call between Williams. Then Kick Sauber and Williams, they're not that far behind Haas, not at all. They're a smidget behind. It's
Exactly.
just that Haas has exactly yes. Haas has that top speed, and the others don't. So Haas can do the wanky strategies to play them around like uh, I don't know like what, but Haas is playing around everybody else in the midfield because they have the top speed and they can block whoever they want for as long as they want. So
Yes.
that's a huge advantage.
So
Probably
for,
if they don't have that advantage, I don't think they would be ahead of Williams or Kick Sauber.
totally agree. And that's my point. At this circuit, it worked out for them. So Haas seventh, Sauber eighth, Williams ninth. or Williams 8th, Sauber 9th, and then 10th was definitely Alpine. I'm with you there.
O-
Absolute shambles.
Okay, in this race, I'd say Sauber is eighth best. In
Okay.
this race, overall the year, I'm not that sure. But in this race, Williams is ninth.
Ace, what did Sauber do this race? Were they racing? Like, did you see them? I didn't see anything. I mean, I wasn't even aware Bottas and Joe entered this race. What on earth was going on there? What an anonymous race that
So
team had. What was going on there?
I'm going by memory. Joe retired. I think we saw him pit stop twice in 2 consecutive laps, and then gearbox problem, retired the car. And then Bottas instead, he did a very fancy strategy because he started on the softs at the restart, then he pitted very, very, very early, and it worked because he was ahead of Tsunoda in the first stint. Then I lost track of what Sauber was doing. I think Bottas was stuck behind Magnussen. I'm not sure how, because I didn't follow the midfield that closely. And then he was stuck behind Magnussen the entire race. That's uh, that's Kick Sauber.
And that ties into your point earlier about the top speed of the Haas really causing problems for the immediate peers of Haas. So fair enough. The race played out like that. You know, some teams got it right with the strategy. Some teams definitely got it wrong or got very unlucky, as we've touched on. And it was a race that showed that small things make a big difference. This is what I took away from this race. A small error from Leclerc made a big difference. A small millisecond of pit stop brilliance by RB made a big difference. You know, these are the things in F1 that determine who wins and who loses. And actually, this weekend was a good example of that. You know, we really saw things that if you're a casual fan, you're just watching, you may think, oh, that doesn't matter. No, it does matter. It matters massively. And in a way, I enjoyed that because that's what F1's about, the fine details. You know, the devil is in the detail. That's what they always say. And this race really showed us that, don't you think?
Yes, it definitely had some good points to talk about. Definitely thanks to the red flag at the start, because that made for very fancy strategies, a wide variety of them. And so, yeah, very good race, quite enjoyable. Of course, it's in the context of another race dominated by Red Bull, in which there was no fight for the win. So
Right.
let's not take this out of this context. In the context of the nth Verstappen victory from Paul with nobody challenging him, yes, great race in that context.
Okay,
Lots to
mate.
talk about.
Okay, mate. Out of 10, what do you rank? What do you rate this race? Out of 10
I'm not sure.
stars,
Let's
what do
say
you?
5,
Okay.
because I'm not taking out of context. So good race, no fight for win. So 5 out of 10.
Okay. I'll give it a 6, but I'm with you there. It wasn't exactly a classic, was it? It wasn't the 2005 Japanese Grand Prix, was it? Not even
Yeah,
close.
but how many races are as good as Japan 2005?
None. Oh, there's a few out there that are good. But in Japan, especially, we'll never forget that one. Suzuka 2000 was a great one because of what was at stake. I mean, that was an amazing weekend. There was a couple other races like '03 Japan, the Senna Prost duels in '88, '89, '90. But this wasn't one of those. This was a very moderately entertaining race at times. It wasn't a classic, but it doesn't mean there isn't interesting parts of the race or things that we didn't think were fascinating to observe and see how they played out. Let's rank the drivers. And I want to do this a little bit differently. Let's rank our top three drivers. You'll go first, then I'll go. And then let's rank our bottom three drivers. And then I want you to give a little bit of a prediction of how you see the next few races to go. We can talk about that in a second, but let's just start with top three drivers, Ace. Give me your top three and why. Let's hear it.
I'm Verstappen, Sainz, Perez, because they drove as well as they could. Probably Alonso and Tsunoda at the same level. Also maybe Hulkenberg, Magnussen. I'm not sure. I'd rather go safe. Verstappen, Sainz, Perez.
Yeah, that is really safe, and I'm surprised because I think you usually sometimes throw in that, let's say that wild card, but it's fair. Verstappen, Sainz, Perez. It's a good top three. So my top three drivers are Verstappen, Ocon, and Sainz. I think they all just maximize their cars. I'll go quickly with my bottom three. I'm going to go with Piastri. Then I'm going to go with. Um, I was not very impressed with Logan Sargent. I'm going to put him in there. And then I think the final person I'll put in there, just because he was just, anonymous as usual, was Joe. So those are my bottom three drivers of the race. Do you have a bottom three?
Piastri, Ricciardo, and maybe not Hamilton. So let's put Gasly.
I'll swap my Joe for your Ricardo as well, actually. So I'll put Ricardo in my bottom three too. And then finally, do we have a feeling for the next few races? Look, I don't think we're going to see anything different. I really don't. I think we're going to continue to see Red Bull lead the way. And I think Ferrari have really solidified themselves as the second quickest team. I wish I could tell people listening that I think there's going to be a wild card, but just get used to this. The only chance I think we're going to see of a classic or a surprise result is if a Red Bull car breaks down. What do you think?
I think the pecking order is gonna stay exactly the same up until Imola, when everybody's bringing upgrades. So I have no big expectation from Shanghai and Miami.
Well said. Well, Ace, it was a pleasure to discuss this race with you, my friend. We missed Peter. We missed Nav, but they'll be on the next episodes for sure. So tune in next time on the DRS Train podcast. Thank you for listening. Have a great rest of your day.